mentioned in the first presentation this morning that as well as the FR family of models, there was this thing, the IFLA Working Group on Aggregates report. And it was published in 2011. And it explicitly states at the end of the report that they do not recommend anybody to implement the report before consolidation of the entire functional requirements models. Some of you who have read the report may realise why that was said. There is a dissenting appendix in that report, which is larger than the report itself. The working group on aggregates could not come to an overall agreement about the basic way of modelling aggregates. Fortunately, the editors of the LRM have been able to make that judgment. And whether you like it or not, this is what the LRM says, and that is what RDA has implemented. So the LRM, for those who are interested, actually follows the main recommendation of the aggregates report and does not accept the dissenting appendix. The dissenting appendix said there was no need for any special consideration of aggregates because the whole part relationships could apply generically across the board. The LRM says no such thing. It says there's a distinction between whole part relationships and aggregate relationships. So an aggregate is defined in the LRM as a manifestation embodying multiple expressions. So anything that has more than one expression in it is an aggregate. In addition to embodying multiple expressions, every aggregate manifestation also embodies an expression of the aggregating work. Now, we are in serious terminological difficulties here with the use of the word aggregate and aggregating and aggregation, etc. In RDA, we've tried to be very clear in the language. We're still working on it. So sometimes you are going to get a little bit confused, and I will try and use the correct phrasing. So there has to be a work which aggregates, which says how I'm going to aggregate, what expressions I'm going to embody in the manifestation. It selects expressions, not works, because you can't embody a work as such without saying which version, which translation, which expression you are including in the content of the aggregation, of the aggregated manifestation. And so there is a hidden work, which is the LRM describes as being the kind of glue that chooses the expressions to aggregate, sequences them, and then wraps them with, for example, a title page, page numbering, and all that other editorial stuff that you typically find, and we usually ignore. And the good news is we don't have to pay too much attention to it with the new model either. So this is better illustrated by a diagram. So this is taken from the LRM itself, the general model for aggregates. And on one side, can this pointer work? Which one is it? Yeah, this one. This is the multiple expressions which are embodied in a single aggregate manifestation. And of course, according to the model, every expression has a corresponding work. It's a one-to-one relationship. And then the aggregate manifestation also embodies something called the aggregating work, which is this intellectual conception that I'm going to aggregate something. My aggregation is going to consist of 100 poems by Lord Byron translated into etc., etc. And it has an aggregating expression which is also embodied in the aggregate manifestation. So the aggregating work is a plan for aggregation. And the aggregating expression realizes the plan by packaging the expressions that are aggregated. There are no whole part relationships in this diagram. The LRM is very clear on this. There are no whole-part relationships in an aggregate unless there's already a whole-part relationship at the expression or work level. So in RDA, we've adapted this very slightly. It's not really changed its nature. The definition in RDA of an aggregate is a manifestation that embodies an aggregating work and one or more expressions of one or more works that realize the plan for aggregation. Apologies. But that's really what we're trying to say. This really is the definition. So here's an example. This is the same structure as the LRM diagram. So we have this aggregating work, which is actually called the Selected Poetry of Lord Byron. So the title of the work is derived from the title of the manifestation in the usual way. And that work has the aggregating expression plan. And that's embodied in here. I've deliberately reversed the arrows and the direction of things, but they mean the same thing. You start with the manifestation, in other words. So this is what you start with, and then you tease out what these bits are. And so I've chosen two of the poems, and they're not me actually, it's my colleague Deborah Fritz, who is chair of the Aggregates Working Group, who's come up with this example. So there are two poems by Byron, She Walks in Beauty and To Belshazzar. They are in their original English and they are embodied in the Selected Poetry of Lord Byron. If we were to take the same works and instead aggregate the French expressions, the French translations, we would have a different aggregate. So that's the important thing. I don't know whether it's still in the LRM, but at one point there was an observation by one of its authors, Patrick Leboeuf, which is basically that most manifestations are aggregates, which is a bit of a surprise to everybody. But when you look at it, very few manifestations only embody a single expression. Most have additional information, like an introduction or an index, or something like that. And these are works and expressions which have been embodied in the same manifestation. Most things are aggregates. The good news is, LRM again clearly states this, is no way do we have to record every entity that we see in this diagram. The beauty of the LRM and its integrity is that we can easily just record that bit, right? And these bits get recorded in the contents note. It's exactly what we do right now. Or we're only interested in this poem. Maybe it's got a famous translation in French, and we want to know all the places that that poem appears in. So we actually describe this bit fully with its manifestations, and these bits are notes, you know, published with To Belshazzar or included in Selected Poetry of Lord Byron. So it doesn't matter whether you do any of these. One library might say we do it this way because we have a different focus, a different application. Another library will do something different, but we can bring everything together and will still remain coherent. And in fact, by bringing the data together, we actually give a better service to end users because there's more information about what's in this anthology of poetry. In addition to the basic structural diagram in the LRM, the LRM provides an additional new relationship element called aggregated by or aggregates in its inverse direction. And this is not necessary, but it's very, very helpful in modeling. And it links the aggregating expression with each of the expressions that are aggregated. And that means that if you've got this aggregating work in 3 different carrier types, 3 different manifestations, microform, print, online, we don't have to do the whole diagram every time. we can go to the expression of the plan and then just go down to each of the manifestations. So it's a kind of shorthand way of describing the same model. The LRM identifies three distinct types of aggregation. There is the collection aggregate, a collection of expressions. Example, 3 novels of Jane Austen. Each of these is an independent expression of an independent work. The second kind of aggregate is the augmentation aggregate, and we're very familiar with this in original RDA, where we talk about primary and secondary content, and we talk about, we give instructions on recording the primary expression and then either recording, augmenting content as a note or whatever. So an example of that would be Austen's novel Emma, with an introduction and commentary. So the introduction and the commentary constitute expressions of separate works. And so this aggregate has three expressions in it, but one of them is clearly the primary focus of the manifestation. That's the novel Emma. Normally, and I stress normally, we would not bother only cataloguing the introduction and then saying it's the introduction to Emma in a note. However, there are several famous counterexamples. I think the John Rylands Library in Manchester years and years ago catalogued introductions to various manifestations because they were written by Graham Greene, and Graham Greene was an alumnus of the university, and they wanted everything he'd ever written. They weren't actually interested in what it was an introduction to. So there's a genuine use case for this approach. And finally, and this is really relevant to this audience, there are the parallel aggregates. That's where the same work is published in 2 different expressions in a single manifestation. So all of the government publications of Canada, in fact, are parallel expressions. And just to make life really, really complicated, that was the easy bit, a real aggregate can consist of more than one type. So you can easily imagine real-world examples where all 3 types of aggregate are presented in a single manifestation. But do not panic, because you don't have to record everything. As long as you stick to the instructions in RDA Toolkit, then whatever choice you make is going to be compatible with whatever choice anybody else makes. That's all I'm going to say about aggregates, because much more exciting are serials. So all the serials catalogued in the audience, just take a very deep breath, because this is what the LRM says. These are not my words. Serials are complex constructs that combine both whole-part relationships and aggregation relationships. And this needs a little bit of interpretation. When it says the complete serial manifestation, we're talking about the manifestation of the whole serial. It may be manifested in discrete issues, but each of those is treated on its own. The whole thing has a whole-part relationship, because the whole serial is issued in parts called issues. And this is where we get the idea of diachronic works. Another essential part of the definition of serial in the LRM is that these individual issues are published over time. They're not published simultaneously. And this is true even if some serials happen to only have one issue. We know of thousands of examples where a new serial is published and it lasts one issue, and the publisher just says, we didn't make any money off it, and that's the end of the serial. But it's still a serial. Each individual issue that is issued as a separate manifestation of the serial itself is an aggregate. It aggregates the articles using the classic, if I can call it that, aggregate model that I've just shown you. And again, a reminder that some serials may have issues that actually only consist of a single article, but they can still be treated as if they had multiple expressions. You just described one. When we looked at this in RDA, and I have to pay tribute to the work of the RSC Aggregates working group here, they've been working very, very hard for well over 2 years, looking not just at the LRM, but at the other underlying model PRESS-00, which again is an IFLA standard allied to the SIDOC CRM. Together we evolved this more general concept of diachronic works. Diachronic work is a work that is planned to be embodied over time. And of course, it doesn't necessarily have to be a serial. It might be a monographic series that's planned to be embodied over time. It's an integrating resource that's planned to be embodied over time. And having come up with this new concept, we knew we were on the right track because the RDA Onyx framework, which is a piece that JSC developed with the publisher community and the Onyx codes way back, at least 10 years ago, that provides a sub-ontology for how content is intended to change over time. The RDA Onyx framework is actually what we use to distinguish carrier and content types in RDA. And in the new toolkit, you will see a lot more information about the relationship between, say, a carrier type and the underlying framework attributes. But the framework wasn't just confined to manifestation types, it also looks at content. And it has this, these 3 attributes about how content is intended or not intended to change. So an example is there's an attribute that distinguishes succession versus integration. In succession, content accumulates with each issue, but nothing gets removed or overlaid. In integration, the whole manifestation and expression is constantly changing every time there's a new iteration of the integrating resource. And we've been able to digest, if we could call it that, the framework, and come up with some high-level terms to describe the different kinds of ways that content might change over time. So you can have integrating and determinate, which means it's an integrating resource, but it has a planned duration. A typical example would be the website of the Olympic Games. It's an integrating resource, but we know it's going to stop changing its content when the games finish. We can have an integrating indeterminate plan. That's a website that goes on forever. A static plan means it's not diachronic. We're not intending to change the content. A successive determinate would be a monograph that's split up, a serialization of a monograph, like the Sherlock Holmes stories or the Pickwick Papers, the Dickens stories, were originally published as diachronic works. And we have successive indeterminate plans, and that's a typical serial. It's never ending. So this is the vocabulary. You see it has the same structure in the toolkit as the media type vocabulary that Kathy showed. So it's going to get really complicated from here on in, but there's only another 5 minutes to go. And so we often refer to the WEMI stack or the WEM stack as we discuss the relationship between the 4 primary entities in RDA. And the reason we call it a stack is because there is a specific kind of relationship between work expression and manifestation item of the same resource. And these are the so-called cardinality constraints. So a work must have at least one expression. An expression must have at least one manifestation, and the manifestation must consist of at least one item. These are requirements, otherwise we're not making a coherent description. All resources have these properties. When we go the other way, an item can exemplify only one manifestation. Manifestation must exemplify at least one expression. If it's more than one, it's an aggregate. And an expression is locked into work because an expression can only realize one work, one and only one work. And this is what allows data integrity from a machine actionable point of view. We have special relationships like work manifested, manifestation of work, etc., but they are also accompanied in the instructions and guidance in the new toolkit by these rules. And now I'm going to say these are rules, they're not instructions. If you do not follow these rules, you are not creating well-formed RDA metadata. When we come to a diachronic work, we impose even more constraints on it. I'm discarding item for reasons I mentioned in the first presentation. It's irrelevant at this point. In a diachronic work, we have something called the when lock. And that means that work's expressions and manifestations are locked one-on-one. In a diachronic work. A diachronic work can only have one expression, it must have one expression. And that expression must be embodied in one manifestation only. So a plan for diachronic content is locked into all three entities, all three aspects of the description of the diachronic resource. Any change in a characteristic of any of the W, E, and M entities means a change in plan, and therefore a new diachronic work. The New York Times, published in print on CD-ROM and online, is therefore 3 separate works. There is not one work with 3 expressions here. The reason is we're talking about the future. This is a plan for future embodiment in the manifestation. But we don't control the future. World War III could happen tomorrow, in which case the future ends there. More likely, the New York Times publisher decides that nobody's bothering with the CD-ROM any longer, so they stop that part of how they issue it. And if we were to use the traditional hierarchical method of one work and multiple expressions and manifestations, there would be this implication that if the CD-ROM stops, then the rest of it stops. And that is not an implication we want to put across. It's not true. So in the new model of serials, each of these is a separate work. All the serials librarians now faint. But we're going to try and explain this in a lot more detail, and indeed the LRM itself has a special chapter on trying to explain this complexity. It's complex. The working group on aggregates could not agree on this. So what do we do? Well, remember, you don't have to record everything. You don't have to record all the bits and pieces. You can use unstructured descriptions to record, notes and relationships and things like that. But we've also introduced a new clustering mechanism. We originally called this work clusters, but then we realized that it was not the same thing as what OCRC means by a work cluster. It's very, very different. And so we relabeled it as work groups. And a work group is just a set of works that's identified as a whole. It's that simple. And how do you identify something? You give it a name or a nomen. So we've given three of what we call the appellation elements are assigned between a work and a work group. The work group is not an entity. It's just a label that says we're talking about the same thing. So you can have an authorized access point for the work group, which would be what we traditionally call the uniform title for New York Times. Or you could use an undistinguished appellation. That's just there for cheap and dirty approaches. Or you can use an identifier for the work group. And guess what? There's already a concept like this. The ISSN-L identifies a group of serials, each of which has a separate ISSN because they're different carrier types. Remember, there's a separate ISSN for the online version as opposed to the original print version. Not everybody pays any attention to this, much to the chagrin of the ISSN International Centre. But they're a standards body too, and you've got to follow their standards, otherwise you're not creating well-formed data. All of this that I've shown you has been agreed with by the ISSN International Centre, and we issued a joint declaration paper 2 months ago to say that this is the joint approach we were taking. The ISSN manual is undergoing review. It's about to undergo a review process, and it will be paying attention to the impact of the LRM and indeed RDA. I should also say, and preempt a question, that we had a special subgroup of the Aggregates working group called the Serials Task Force, and it had 2 representatives from CONSERT on it, as well as the American ISSN Centre at the Library of Congress. And they've approved all of this, you know, still worried about the detail and about how it's going to be applied in practice. But as a model and as an implementation of the model, this is the way we have to go. So RDA defines a serial work. We don't use the word serial. We have to say what thing it is. It's a serial work. A work intended to be realized in multiple distinct expressions embodied during a time span with no ending. Indeterminate, successive. And we don't say whether the issues are aggregates or not, because we want a more general approach. The aggregates part is handled separately. The LRM provides us with some familiar relationships between these serials and some new relationships which we've absorbed into the new toolkit. So in a serial work, issues can have a preceding or a succeeding relationship with each issue, and it's logical, not chronological. All the serials librarians, how many times have you received a serial out of publication sequence because for some reason issue 3 was delayed and issue 4 is published before issue 3? We can still model the correct planned issue sequence using precedes. It's logical, not chronological. If you change your plan, New York Times decides it's going to produce a French edition, then it's a new serial because you've changed the characteristic of its expression. But we can say the original English New York Times is being transformed into the French New York Times, and it's a policy change. There's a whole bunch of these. And then we have the expression-to-expression relationship I've already shown in the aggregates diagram. It was aggregated by or aggregates. We built all of these into RDA. Existing RDA relationships, derivation relationships, for example, have been recategorized. They remain the same, their semantics remain the same, but they've been recategorized and grouped into this hierarchy produced by the LRM. And this is it, fainting time. This is a typical serial work. And it doesn't address any of the aggregates complications. So this is just the diachronic aspects of it. So what we have here is a diachronic work that starts off, it gets issued. I haven't put what the relationships are, but this is an aggregation relationship or an issue relationship. It gets issued in 2 issues. Each of those issues expressions has its own work, and we can say that one work precedes the other. And the whole bunch, the whole lot of it is aggregated in the serial aggregate manifestation. Each of these issues has its own manifestation as well. But then they decide to change the carrier type. And so we have a new serial over here, the same kind of thing occurs, and we have a transformation relationship between the 2 diachronic works. Now, in reality, the numbering of these issues might not change at all. So what in reality you might see is issue 1, issue 2A, issue 1B, issue 2B in that order. But underneath it, we have a coherent, well-formed model that allows us to take care of the real complexities that real serials offer us. Different editions, splits, mergers, all sorts of stuff. If you want to know a lot more about this, read the Press 00 standard, because it goes into this in huge detail. This is the most complicated structure you will ever have to catalog. So serials librarians, you are the creme de la creme. You deal with the most difficult resource description we can think of. So, you can relax again. Accompanying implementation, I should stress in that previous diagram, right, we do not ever imagine that all of these boxes will have its own description, all these entities will have different descriptions. I think in I don't know, a serials agency, even the ISSN may have to model, describe at this level of complexity. But most libraries are going to use cut-down versions of this. So other things that accompany a change over time are, well, when is the data valid? What happens if the title changes? First 5 words rule. Or what happens if the editor of the serial changes? What happens if the name of the publisher changes? So we've introduced 2 what we call data provenance elements, which allow you to note when a particular data statement is valid. So you can say it was called New York Times between 1951 and 1973, and then it became the New York Times. I'm making it up, of course. And then it becomes valid from there. We can also do a scope of validity, which is really a much more freer form of saying, well, it's valid between issues 1 and 27, and from issue 28 onwards, it's valid. A different value is valid. Another consequence of this is we've had to move some elements from manifestation to work. An individual manifestation cannot possibly have a frequency. Think about it. It's a one-off. So frequency has been moved up to work. The plan is to issue quarterly or monthly or irregularly. The ISSN refers to the work and not the manifestation. Because the work is locked with the manifestation changes, the work changes. This caused consternation in the ISSN Centre when we first discussed it, until we realised that the when lock meant we didn't have to do anything different. And I'll just reinforce again that we're liaising with the ISSN International Centre and the ISPD Review Group, which again is reviewing things, to continue the harmonisation process, which has been underway since 2002. following a meeting between these three organisations in Washington at the Library of Congress. So we continue to harmonise in what is a very complicated situation. That's it. Merci beaucoup.
Donc, le temps a filé, malheureusement, donc on a déjà... on avait prévu une période de questions d'une quinzaine de minutes. Je pense que vous avez fait poser des questions à Gordon sur la dernière partie, mais si vous êtes d'accord, on va peut-être laisser tomber la dernière période de questions générales, ou alors, si vous avez vraiment des questions pressantes, je vous inviterai à le faire maintenant. Donc, est-ce qu'il y a des questions concernant les agrégats, les œuvres diachroniques? Well, I would have a question myself, but if I'll say it in English so that Gordon can understand, but what maybe wasn't necessarily explicit in the presentation is that even though we were used to think of Diachronic Works as mostly continuing resources, but with the new LRM way of thinking, now some resources that we used to think as being multi-part monographs could be considered diachronic works. Am I right?
Correct. Yeah.
So what it means is that a novel that is published over time, like part one, volume one year, volume two another year, etc., well, that would be now diachronic work and would be different than a work that's published like all volumes together.
Yeah, the reason is we can't predict the future. So, and there are many examples of multi-part monographs which never actually get completed. You know, so dictionaries that get, you know, A to D, E to G, H to N, nothing.
Complete works of a composer.
The complete works of a composer. You know, we've discussed what does complete works mean. What happens when you discover a long lost manuscript, you know. All sorts of things. So I think I'd also like to say that in some of the work that the Aggregates working group has done, they've been able to show that we can now catalogue using that very complicated model things that we just avoided in the past. Like, how do you catalogue a blog? You know, I've already mentioned wikis, project wikis. How do you catalogue those? Because we had no real model for doing it, but now we do. And again, I'm expecting to see, once we've digested it for you, that's what we're trying to do, is make the whole thing simpler and make the machine do the work. I expect a much wider application of this model to things that we've previously not catalogued.
Thank you, merci.